Hey guys, hoping all is well with everyone. So in this video, I'm going to be continuing the read-along of The Secret Zoo, Secrets and Shadows by Brian Chick. And last time we finished, we completed Chapter 6, so we'll be starting today with Chapter 7. And as always, although The Secret Zoo doesn't have usually a lot of pictures, I'll be showing you guys any letters from Mr. Darby or messages that Marlowe delivers to the Action Scouts. But please, as always, feel free to follow along. Chapter 7, The Library of the Secret Society. The teenagers veered off the street and led the scouts between two columns with a blue banner that read, "The Library of the Secret Society," with shiny gold letters. They climbed a wide stairway that led to a massive, octagonal building with a high glass roof. The stairway surrounded the entire library, its sharp ends bending, creating 8 distinct sections. The top of each section had a landing with its own entrance into the building, and on each landing was a fountain from which water sprayed. Blizzard and Little Bighorn lumbered up the steps, their muscular backs shifting and pitching the scouts about. The stairs were crowded with people and animals, all holding books. The animals had found unique ways to carry them. A kangaroo hopped past Noah, its pouch brimming with comics. A cheetah ran around Blizzard, its jaws locked on a thick dictionary. A Komodo dragon slipped beneath Little Bighorn, books strapped to its back. Undoubtedly, these animals were returning books on behalf of people. As intelligent as many of the secret zoo animals were, Noah was certain they couldn't read. He stared up at the library, awestruck. At least 20 stories high, it was made of marble. On each story, a balcony stretched around the entire library. Trees grew on both sides of the library walls, their limbs reaching through the windows and marble blocks in both directions. Noah wondered if P-Dog and Podgy would be able to climb the long staircase. He looked down and spotted the prairie dogs leaping from step to step, yipping in defiance of the challenge. Then Podgy flew past, his stomach a mound of blubber dangling beneath his flapping flippers. The penguin gracefully touched down at the top of the staircase beneath sprays of water that arched between two fountains. "Nice landing, Podge," Noah said. Podgy pumped his flippers once to say thanks. Blizzard heaved his weight over the top step engraved with the words "Library of the Secret Society. Check it out." The scouts and the animals followed their escorts to the closest entrance, a wide doorway draped with long trails of pearls and glass beads. People and animals flooded in and out through the doorway, making the beads clink together and reflect light in all directions. Once inside, Noah turned to watch the others. As P-Dog stepped in, he caught a bead in his eye and chomped at the offending glass globule. The others made it through without a problem. "Holy smokes!" Richie gasped, craning his neck back and forth. "Look at this place!" Noah was already doing just that. It would have been impossible not to. He guessed that it reached at least 600 feet across, roughly the length of 2 football fields. 20 stories above was an elaborate glass ceiling with painted engravings depicting the mingling of nature, animals, and books. Sunlight burst through it, streaking bright rays in which thousands of particles danced. Falling leaves colored the air, and fallen leaves carpeted the floor. Trees and towering bookcases loomed over everything like walls in a colossal maze. The trees provided a framework for the bookcases. Shelves were attached to trunks, and rows of books were stacked along horizontal branches. Along the inner perimeter of the library, Noah saw the same marble balconies that he'd seen on the outside. One per story, they shared a huge space with the trees and bookcases. Narrow walkways extended from them and stretched across the library to new places. People strolled along, skimming titles with their fingers and plucking books from the shelves. Staring at the surroundings, Ella said, "You have got to be kidding!" She made each word pop as she said it. Noah said, "But the trees, they have to grow. What what happens then?" Solana surprised Noah by answering, "They adjust." "Huh?" "The bookcases. They adjust." "Adjust? How?" Solana answered by pointing up a velvet patch near the spot where a tree limb had grown through a bookcase. Noah scanned the other bookcases. Wherever the trees had been grown through the wood, similar velvet patches were nearby. He had seen these patches before on the teenagers' clothes. Noah's eyes dropped to the back of Solana's jacket, where strips of white velvet ran along the vertical seams. It was surely the same velvet that hung throughout the city's species at the entrances of the sectors. They adjust, she had said. What exactly did that mean? And would Solana's jacket adjust because of its velvet? Noah watched Sam lean over and whisper in Solana's ear. She nodded, but said nothing. How does the velvet work? Noah asked. What gives the velvet its power? This time, Solana offered no response. Noah was sure she had taken instructions from Sam to stop answering questions. It was becoming clear that the scouts couldn't trust the teenagers. Noah frowned and returned his attention to the library. Monkeys crowded the heights. They wore blue vests that buttoned up in the front, marking them as the first clothed animals that Noah had seen in the secret zoo. One of them would occasionally snatch a book from a shelf, climb to a bridge or jump to the ground, and pass it to a human patron. The monkeys, Noah said to Megan. They're handling books for people. They work here. Megan nodded. Too cool, huh? The group reached an intersection in the aisles, where they stopped to set a line of slow-moving sloths pass. Cameron propped his fists against his hips, irritated by the delay. An old lady with beaded eyeglasses, plump cheeks, and a kind face came toward them. Deep wrinkles folded from the corner of her eyes. On her name tag was printed Mrs. Fellerton. She was walking beside a tortoise with a large wire box full of neatly stacked books strapped to its shell. The tortoise seemed to be acting as Mrs. Fellerton's book cart. She stopped directly beside Ella and Richie and said, "First time inside?" "Yeah," said Ella. "But how? I mean, the books are so high, and the trees." Mrs. Fellerton chuckled. "We fetch most of the books for our patrons. It's always been that way. It must seem odd for someone who's visiting our library for the first time." Noah saw the opportunity to get an answer to his question. He glanced at Sam to be sure he wasn't paying attention and leaned toward the librarian. "The velvet patches on the bookshelves. How do they get their power?" The librarian smiled. "The power doesn't come from the velvet. The power comes from the books and the wisdom and the worlds they contain." The kind lady swept her arm high in the air. "The velvet simply gathers the powers in the books and materializes it into something you can see, which are the changes to the bookshelves." Noah scrunched up his face. The librarian was talking in riddles. "Be patient," said Mrs. Fellerton. "Knowledge comes with time. Nothing else." "But," Noah's voice trailed off when he realized the librarian wasn't going to answer him directly. Cameron turned to the little bighorn and Blizzard and said, "Come on, guys. Darby's this way." The group hung a left turn and headed down an aisle so narrow that little bighorn's sides nearly rubbed against the shelves. Noah craned his neck. The towering woodwork made the space above him appear to narrow gradually, an illusion created by the height of the bookcases. The animals followed Tamarin as he turned down another aisle, and another, and another. Nearing the middle of the library, the group heard the lulling splash of falling water. "What's that noise?" Ella asked no one in particular. "The Fountain Forum," Solana answered. "That's where we're headed." Marlowe turned on Noah's shoulder, brushing his feathers across the scout's cheek. Noah was reminded of another bird, Podgy. He peered over his shoulder to see the big penguin waddling along, staring blankly at his surroundings. Around him, the prairie dogs were chasing one another, racing between the books on the bottom shelves and tunneling in and out of the leaves. Podgy barely seemed to notice them. He just waddled forward, his flippers pressed flat against his sides and his webbed feet slinging colorful leaves into the air. They rounded one more bookcase and stepped into a clearing. Here, a circular formation of pillars pushed through the treetops and stretched hundreds of feet to the ceiling, where they helped support the glass roof. In the middle of the pillars was a long oval fountain. Around it, people read books in plush chairs with wide armrests and pillowy ottomans. They looked utterly relaxed, as if on the verge of deep meditation, or, perhaps, of falling asleep in the literal blink of their eyes. As the scouts and their escorts passed the readers, an old man bounced out of a chair and dropped his book to his seat as the purple velvet trench coat draped around his feet. Narrow, rectangular sunglasses concealed his eyes but exposed his bushy eyebrows. His gray beard was as long and shaggy as his ponytail. Mr. Darby. "Dear Scouts," he said. The old man brushed his hand down his beard. "I hope your travels weren't too arduous." "I guess that depends on what arduous means," said Ella. "If it means being tossed through a jungle by a bunch of monkeys, then yep, pretty arduous." Mr. Darby smiled. "Once you learn to fully trust the apes, the secret metropolis will be a pleasure to cross." From the chair beside Mr. Darby's, another man rose. The sheen on his bald head matched that of the shiny marble fountain. Towering over everyone, his body bulged with mounds of muscle. Tank. "What's up, little dudes?" he said. "Welcome back." Tank stepped forward and greeted Sam and the other teenagers. Instead of shaking their hands, he reached out his hand and, one by one, let the four of them softly punch it. Megan leaned toward Noah and whispered, "You've got to be kidding me. Tank likes these jerks?" Noah shrugged his shoulders. He was too confused to speak. Something was going on with the teenagers. Something peculiar. Mr. Darby swung his arms toward the scouts' escorts, and saying, "I see you've met the Descenders." "The who?" Noah said. "The Descenders," Mr. Darby repeated. "Tamron, Hannah." Tamron interrupted, saying, "We didn't mention that." Mr. Darby touched a finger to his lips, and his forehead wrinkled. "I suppose there will be plenty of time for words. During the training, I mean." With no hint of enthusiasm, Sam nodded in agreement. "Training," said Ella. Concern furrowed her brow, and she glanced at her friends. "Am I missing something here? Did I, fall asleep and miss 5 minutes of the conversation?" Mr. Darby smiled. Then he stepped in front of the animals that the scouts were sitting on. He reached out and stroked the heads of Blizzard and Little Bighorn. The two animals nudged against his palms lovingly. "I apologize, Scouts. I'm jumping ahead. I haven't mentioned my proposition. The very reason I asked you here today." "Proposition?" said Megan. "I'll put it very simply." Mr. Darby clasped his hands behind his back and spent a moment rocking on his feet. Finally, he touched the snouts of Blizzard and Little Bighorn, leaned forward and whispered, "How would the four of you like to join us?" He frowned. "In preventing the end of the world." Chapter 8. A Proposition at the Fountain Forum. The scouts were silent. They sat perfectly still atop Blizzard and Little Bighorn. In the group around Mr. Darby, only the prairie dogs moved, continuously stirring up leaves as they dashed around the ankles of the polar bear and the rhino. For Noah, Mr. Darby's words jarred a memory of the scouts' first meeting with Tank outside of Creepy Critters. At that time, Tank alluded to someone being in danger, and when Richie asked who, Tank simply replied, "Everyone. The whole world." Now, 2 weeks later, Mr. Darby had insinuated the same thing. Hannah finally ended the silence by popping a bubble and letting the gum smack her mouth. She licked the thin, sticky paste from her lips. "Okay," said Richie, his voice quivering. "All this talk from you guys about the world ending and stuff, it's really starting to freak me out." "I'm with Richie," said Noah. "Understandably," answered Mr. Darby. "It comes with the territory of our plight." Ella said, "Let's hear this proposition, the one where we help save the world." The old man whisked his book off his chair and plopped back into the cushions. He swept one side of his trench coat over his legs and flattened the wrinkles with his palm. Noah found it a bit odd that he would cover himself. Could he possibly be cold? "Over the past 2 weeks, I've spoken at great length with the Secret Council, and we have unanimously decided to offer you the opportunity to become crossers." "Crossers?" said Noah. "You mentioned this the last time we were here." What exactly is a crosser? Mr. Darby gathered his bushy beard in his hand and stroked it to a point. A crosser, in its simplest terms, is someone who passes between our zoos, the Clarksville Zoo and the Secret Zoo. A crosser can cross from one zoo to another, cross an entire sector, or cross from a sector into the city of species. Like we just did, said Ella, through Metropolis. Exactly so. Mr. Darby continued to stroke his beard. As you know, the Clarksville Zoo exhibits have hidden entrances to different sectors of the secret zoo, sectors that connect the city of species, the core of our kingdom. Though these entrances were made for animals, our human crossers use them too. A crosser's biggest responsibility is to guard these entrances, with what we call sector gateways, or simply gateways. To do this successfully, crossers are trained to effectively cross any sector. Are they all human? Richie asked. The crossers, I mean. Not at all, Mr. Darby returned to Megan. Remember the monkeys you spotted on the rooftops of your neighborhood when this all began? Megan nodded. They weren't supposed to be there, right? They snuck out of the zoo. Mr. Darby couldn't restrain a smile. Oh, they snuck out of the zoo, but they most certainly were supposed to be there. They were crossers. Crossers that patrolled the border of the Clarksville Zoo. Some animals post in the trees of your neighborhood at night. We... Whoa, Ella said. Did you just say they post in our trees? Mr. Darby nodded. Indeed. Since when? Ella asked. Since long before you were born. What? Mr. Darby laughed. Then he said, We post tarsiers, mostly, but others as well. Our world invades yours once yours falls to darkness. Way, way, way cool, said Richie. Noah steered the topic back. How many crossers are people? Not many. Most people are dedicated to the inside or the outside. Most don't have the courage to cross, Richie said. And what makes you think we do? Seeing is believing. Huh? You crossed through Little Dogs of the Prairie, Penguin Palace, and the Chamber of Lights without even knowing how to. Don't think this happened without the notice of the Secret Council. Yeah, but we were on top of that. We just put you through a test you passed very smoothly, I should add. What? Said Noah. A test? The secret metropolis, said Mr. Darby. That test was proposed by the Secret Council. I apologize for not announcing it beforehand, but Council insisted that the four of you not know. Mr. Darby glanced at Tank. How many prospective crossers would you say failed to cross the secret metropolis? Tank smiled, and his perfect teeth gleamed like pearls against his dark skin. Don't know, but most of them, that's for sure. Mr. Darby turned back to the scouts. Not many people have the emotional strength to swing across a forest from arms of apes, I assure you. Yet the four of you crossed with ease. Most didn't think you would. Mr. Darby gestured towards Sam and his companions. Even our young descenders doubted your ability. Noah wondered if this was partly why the descenders didn't like them, because the scouts had proven them wrong. Hold on, Ella chimed in. Your crossers don't seem to be doing such a great job of things. Nobody stopped us from sneaking into the secret zoo a few weeks ago. Mr. Darby laughed and said, That's because the animals protecting the sector gateways wanted you in, to find Megan and solve the mystery of her disappearance. Think about it. The prairie dogs, Podgy, Blizzard, Little Bighorn, they're all crossers, and they all wanted you inside. That makes sense, said Megan. But what about me? I was able to sneak in. Which made you the second time our borders were breached, said Mr. Darby. Not so bad, given our history. Who breached your borders the first time? Richie asked. Mr. Darby frowned at the thought. We're about to get to that. Megan shifted the conversation back, saying, "How come I wasn't noticed when I came through the Chamber of Lights? Who was guarding that exhibit?" "Charlie Red, and I assure you, his work is normally exceptional. But that day, Charlie had stepped away from his post to investigate a noise outside the exhibit. By the time he returned, it was too late. You were in." "So that's why he can't stand us," Ella said. "We made him look like a dork." "Perhaps there's some truth in that," said Mr. Darby. "No one likes to look incapable of doing his job." A moment passed without question or comment. Then Mr. Darby continued, "Regarding our crossers, we need more humans. We especially need people to concentrate on the outside. People who can walk our borders in the Clarksville Zoo without raising eyebrows. People who know the surrounding neighborhood, its residents, and properties. People who can cross quickly into the secret zoo during an emergency." Megan chuckled nervously. "Mr. Darby, we're kids. We have families. And school." "Yeah," said Ella. "I have to think that life gets pretty tough for someone who quits the books in 5th grade." Mr. Darby leaned over his knees. "We aren't suggesting that you give up your lives, only that you help us in your free time, that you train with us and be alert for unusual activity on the outside, especially in your neighborhood. Our ability to watch activities on your streets is limited, especially during the day." "Train with you?" said Ella. "Do you have any idea how hard it is for Megan just to get permission to come to the zoo this morning?" "Training wouldn't take the time you might imagine. Maybe 2 hours, twice a week. Much of the training would take place in the Clarksville Zoo, making it that much easier for you." The scouts glanced at one another and silently considered the proposition. Noah thought about how Clarksville Zoo was in their neighborhood, right between their houses and their school. After a bit, Noah asked, "How would it work?" "The Secret Council has proposed that Tank lead your training. He'll be assisted by the Descenders. Sam, Cameron, Hannah, and Solana are 4 of the strongest, most capable crossers we have. You would train slowly, on weekends, evenings, or any days that you have available." "But what would we tell our parents?" Ella asked. "How would we get out of the house?" Mr. Darby looked at Tank, whose smile was broader than ever. The big man reached into a duffel bag beside his chair and pulled out a wad of shirts in a clutch of his massive hand. One by one, he tossed a shirt to each of the scouts. "You'd say this." Noah opened his shirt and laid it on the back of Blizzard's head, a bottom up with vertical stripes. It had an enormous collar that reached across the shoulders. The left side had 2 patches. One had the words Clarksville Zoo in loopsy cursive writing, and the other read Noah. The right side had a breast pocket large enough to fit a Harry Potter paperback. It was the ugliest shirt Noah had ever seen. "Cool," Richie gushed as he buried his entire hand in the pocket. It has a ton of space for my pens and stuff." Ella rolled her eyes. "A nerd in his nerd gear." "What would we do with these?" Noah asked. "You'd work for us," said Mr. Darby. "Only a few hours a week, of course." Richie raised one eyebrow. "You wouldn't, like, expect us to clean the cages or something, would you? I mean the elephants! Have you seen the size of their, you know, poop?" "You don't get it, Richie," Noah said. "Mr. Darby doesn't want us to work for the zoo. He wants us to make it seem like we're working for the zoo. We'll actually be training." "Exactly," Mr. Darby said. "We call it cross-training, but to your families, we could easily mask it as volunteering. As you probably know, the Clarksville Zoo offers volunteer opportunities to students at the local zoos. It's a perfect way to present your training as something acceptable to your parents." "How long would the training take?" Noah asked. "Since you'd only be training a few hours a week, a number of years." "Great," said Ella. "There goes my soccer career." Cameron suddenly stepped forward. I can't take this anymore. He faced Mr. Darby and waved an arm toward the scouts. They're just kids. Kids from the outside, which is even worse. Yeah, they can cross, I'll give them that, but they don't have what it takes. They haven't seen what we've seen. They're not insiders, Mr. Darby. They weren't here the day the shadows were taken. Cameron fell silent. As he turned away, the sunlight struck his jacket at an unusual angle. Noticed that the pleats had thin cuts in the bottom of the folds. He wondered if there was a reason for the cuts, but before he had time to study them, the descender moved out of the light, and they were concealed once more. A prickly silence hung in the air. It was the first awkward moment the scouts had shared with Mr. Darby. Finally, Noah voiced what all the scouts were thinking. What was the day the shadows were taken? Tank shifted in his chair. Hannah stopped blowing air into her bubble, and the pink globe seemed to float in front of her face. The prairie dogs stopped racing and stood on their haunches, their attention switching from Noah to Mr. Darby and back again. Sam took a step toward Mr. Darby. You don't have to answer that. Remember, we're talking to outsiders here. Mr. Darby locked eyes with Sam. For a moment, all that seemed to exist was the contemplative aura about the old man. The splashing water in the fountain made the only sounds. Finally, Mr. Darby turned and faced the scouts. If you wish to know the history of the stolen shadows, it will require your full engagement in our plight. We will need you as crossers, and we will need you not only to be brave, but to be fearless. Mr. Darby paused, giving the scouts time to digest his words. I want you to think before answering. Can you accept the challenge to become one of us? To join our society as crossers who live on the outside? In silence, the scouts traded glances, their eyes communicating more information than words ever could. At last, Noah said, If it means helping you, and if it means helping others, then yes, we accept your invitation to join the secret society. Megan, Ella, and Richie nodded in agreement. Solana turned to Mr. Darby and said, You can't be serious. They don't know what they're getting into. They're kids. Think of their parents. What if their parents... Mr. Darby raised his palm to silence her. The corners of his mouth curled in a smile, and the old man tipped his head at Noah to show his gratitude. Sitting atop a dreadfully powerful polar bear, Noah nodded back. Then welcome. The usual emotion had drained from Mr. Darby's voice. Welcome to our secret society. Blizzard rolled back his head and roared so thunderously that the earth shook. The bookcases rumbled, and every creature in the library held on to branches or furniture to keep from falling. Leaves rained down, flashing color across the magical landscape. The old man smiled, a smile that was both warm and wicked. He wrestled his aged body into a comfortable position in the chair. Then he set his eyes on the scouts and began to tell a tale. That's where I'll stop the video there, ending chapter 8. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and the next time we continue the read-along of The Secret Zoo, we'll be continuing with chapter 9. But as always, guys, please take good care of yourselves, and thank you so much for watching. Take good care.